buckle up because we're diving into some serious election predictions today.
Absolutely.
You sent over some fascinating CNN polling data, and let me tell you, it's got some real head-scratchers.
Election cycles always reveal a lot about the anxieties and aspirations of the electorate.
We're talking demographic shifts, the ever-elusive bro vote, and what it all means for the upcoming election. Are you ready to unpack this with me?
This data in particular highlights some really interesting trends.
Okay, so the first thing that jumped out at me was this idea of a shrinking base.
You're hitting on a crucial point.
CNN's polling suggests Trump's support among non-college educated white voters is down from previous elections. We're talking 33% in 2016 to 27% now. That might not seem like a huge drop, but it's got me wondering, why are even small shifts in this demographic so significant?
It's all about the electoral college map. This group of voters makes up a surprisingly large portion of the electorate in those key battleground states.
Right.
Think Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Those states where elections are often decided by a tiny margin.
Those nail-biter states that keep us glued to our screens every election night.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is that in those specific states, non-college educated white voters often constitute a slim majority. So even a small dip in support within that group could translate to thousands of votes swinging in a different direction.
Wow. Okay, that really puts things into perspective.
It's like a game of inches where every vote carries extra weight.
It's not just about the raw numbers, but where those numbers are concentrated geographically. So if those voters are potentially shifting away from Trump, where are they going?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Are they moving to other candidates, or are they just sitting this one out?
And the data suggests a few possibilities. While Trump seems to be losing some ground with this demographic, he might be making gains in other groups, like Black and Hispanic voters.
So even if he's attracting more voters from those demographics, they might not be numerous enough to offset the potential losses from his base.
However, we need to consider the proportional representation of those groups within the overall electorate. Precisely. It becomes a delicate balancing act. Can smaller gains in certain segments of the voting population outweigh the impact of potential losses from a much larger bloc?
It's almost like a political equation with all these shifting variables.
That's a question that will likely keep political analysts up at night until the very last vote is counted.
Now, speaking of shifting demographics, the data mentions the bro vote and its potential impact on JD Vance's political aspirations.
You're right to be cautious about oversimplifying.
What are your thoughts on that? This whole bro vote thing has always felt a bit reductive to me.
The concept of the bro vote is often painted with a very broad brush, but it's a much more nuanced group than many people realize.
It just seems like there's this assumption that you can predict how a whole group of people will vote just based on a few surface-level characteristics.
Like, are we really saying that everyone who listens to a certain type of music or wears a certain brand of clothing is going to vote the same way? It's just hard to wrap my head around.
It definitely doesn't add up.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you mentioned music because there's a perfect example of this playing out right now in popular culture. Remember that country song,
Oh, yeah.
Rich Men North of Richmond, that went viral a few months back?
Uh-huh.
It sparked a huge debate about class, rural America, and who really represents the working class. Some people embraced it as an anthem, while others criticized its message.
Oh, yeah. I remember seeing all that play out on social media. It felt like everyone had an opinion on that song.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is that both the positive and negative reactions to that song highlight how diverse the so-called bro vote actually is.
Yeah.
You had people who felt deeply seen and understood by the lyrics,
Right.
while others felt like it didn't represent their experiences at all. So it's less about fitting into a neat little demographic box and more about how those individual experiences and anxieties shape a person's political views.
Precisely. And that's why trying to predict how this group might vote based on broad stereotypes can be a recipe for disaster. It's like assuming that everyone who lives in a rural area feels the same way about the economy or immigration. Those are complex issues that resonate differently with individuals based on their own personal experiences and values.
It's like, even within a group that might seem homogenous from the outside, there's actually a lot of diversity of thought and opinion.
Absolutely. And that internal diversity is something that often gets overlooked in those broad stroke analyses. You can't just look at someone's age, race, or education level and automatically assume, their political leanings. It's just not that simple anymore.
Okay, so if we bring this all back to the data we're looking at, with the shrinking base, the potential gains in other demographics, and the complexities of this bro vote, what does it all point to in terms of an overall election prediction?
Well, the data seems to suggest a very close election. Okay.
But, and this is crucial, polls are really just a snapshot in time. They capture sentiment at a particular moment, but we all know things can change quickly in the world of politics, especially in those final weeks leading up to an election.
It's like just when you think you've got a handle on things, some unexpected event happens that throws everything into disarray.
Exactly. Those October surprises can really keep things interesting.
Right.
So, while the data provides valuable insights, it's not a crystal ball. There are just too many factors that could influence the final outcome.
Like voter turnout. I imagine that's going to be a major factor in such a tight race.
Absolutely. And you also have to consider things like last-minute campaign strategies, the impact of debates, and even the potential for external events to sway public opinion.
Yeah.
It's like a giant puzzle where all these pieces are constantly shifting and rearranging themselves.
Which makes predicting the outcome more of an art than a science, I guess.
Exactly. It requires a deep understanding of the electorate, a keen eye for emerging trends, and maybe even a little bit of intuition. So it sounds like trying to predict this election is a bit like trying to predict the weather, you know? You can look at all the data and the historical trends, but there's always a chance of a surprise thunderstorm on election day.
That's a great analogy. And it speaks to the limitations of relying solely on polls and traditional demographic models. We're in a moment where the political landscape is incredibly fluid.
And part of that fluidity, it seems, is that our very understanding of what constitutes a voting bloc is evolving.
Absolutely. Think about it. The very definition of a base or a bloc implies a certain level of stability, a predictable group of voters who can be counted on to support a particular candidate or party. But what we're seeing now is that those lines are blurring. People don't fit into those neat little boxes as easily anymore.
It's like you can't just assume that someone who voted a certain way in the last election will vote the same way in this one. Their circumstances might have changed, their priorities might have shifted, they might even be disillusioned with the whole political system.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to look beyond the surface level demographics and really try to understand the underlying values, anxieties, and aspirations that are driving people's political choices. Because at the end of the day, that's what elections are really about. A reflection of who we are as a society and what we hope for the future.
It makes you realize that every single vote represents a complex human story, a set of experiences and beliefs that have led that person to make a particular choice in the voting booth.
And that's what makes this whole process so fascinating to study, especially for someone like me who's interested in the sociological forces that shape our world. Because even though we might not be able to predict the outcome of this election with absolute certainty, by digging into the data and examining the trends, we can gain a deeper understanding of the social and cultural currents that are shaping our political landscape.
It's like we're witnessing a realignment of sorts, right? Where the old political maps no longer apply and we're still figuring out what the new ones will look like.
Precisely. And that makes for a very dynamic and, frankly, unpredictable political climate. But one thing's for sure, it's never been more important to engage in thoughtful, informed discussions about the issues that matter most to us.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, remember that your vote is your voice. Do your research, stay informed, and make your voice heard on Election Day. And if you're ever feeling overwhelmed by all the noise and the data, just remember, behind every statistic is a human story, and those stories are what make this whole process so incredibly fascinating and important.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've done our part to unpack some of the complexities of this election cycle. It's been a pleasure diving deep with you today.
Likewise. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of election predictions, demographic shifts, and the ever-evolving bro vote. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those brainwaves buzzing.